The early history of Jamestown was, to say the least, not promising. The colony's leadership changed repeatedly, its inhabitants suffered an extraordinarily high death rate, and, with the company seeking a quick profit, supplies from England proved inadequate. The hopes of locating riches such as the Spanish had found in Mexico were quickly dashed. "Silver and gold they have none," one Spanish observer commented. Their local resources were not much to be regarded, and they had no commerce with any nation. The first settlers were a quarrelsome band of gentlemen and servants. They included few farmers and laborers and numerous sons of English gentry and high-status craftsmen, jewelers, stonecutters and the like, who preferred to prospect for gold rather than farm. "They would rather starve than work," declared John Smith, one of the colony's first leaders. Jamestown lay beside a swamp containing malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the garbage settlers dumped into the local river-bred germs that caused dysentery and typhoid fever. Disease and lack of food took a heavy toll. By the end of the first year, the original population of 104 had fallen by half. New arrivals, including the first two women who landed in 1608, brought the numbers up to 400 in 1609. But by 1610, after a winter long remembered as the starving time, only 65 settlers remained alive. At one point, the survivors abandoned Jamestown and sailed for England, only to be intercepted and persuaded to return to Virginia by ships carrying a new governor, 250 colonists, and supplies. By 1616, about 80% of the immigrants who had arrived in the first decade were dead. Only rigorous military discipline held the colony together. John Smith was a forceful man whose career before coming to America included a period fighting the Turks in Hungary, where he was captured and for a time enslaved. He imposed a regime of forced labor on company lands. "He that will not work shall not eat," Smith declared. Smith's autocratic mode of governing alienated many of the colonists. After being injured in an accidental gunpowder explosion in 1609, he was forced to return to England. The Virginia Company slowly realized that for the colony to survive, it would have to abandon the search for gold, grow its own food, and find a marketable commodity. It would also have to attract more settlers. With this end in view, it announced new policies in 1618 that powerfully shaped Virginia's development as a functioning society, rather than an outpost of London-based investors. Instead of retaining all the land for itself, the company introduced the headright system, awarding 50 acres of land to any colonist who paid for his own or another's passage. Thus, anyone who brought in a sizable number of servants would immediately acquire a large estate. In place of the governor's militaristic regime, a charter of grants and liberties was issued, including the establishment of a House of Burgesses. When it convened in 1619, this became the first elected assembly in colonial America. The House of Burgesses was hardly a model of democracy, only freemen could vote, and the company and its appointed governor retained the right to nullify any measure the body adopted. But its creation established a political precedent that all English colonies would eventually follow. Also in 1619, the first 20 Africans arrived in Virginia on a Dutch vessel. When the English arrived at Jamestown, they landed in an area inhabited by some 15,000 to 25,000 Indians living in numerous small agricultural villages. Most acknowledged the rule of Wahunsonacock, a shrewd and forceful leader who had recently consolidated his authority over the region and collected tribute from some 30 subordinate tribes. Called Powhatan by the settlers after the Indian word for both his tribe and his title of paramount chief, he quickly realized the advantages of trade with the newcomers. For its part, mindful of Las Casas's condemnation of Spanish behavior, the Virginia Company instructed its colonists to treat local Indians kindly and to try to convert them to Christianity. Realizing that the colonists depended on the Indians for food, John Smith tried to stop settlers from seizing produce from nearby villages, lest the Indians cut off all trade. In the first 2 years of Jamestown's existence, relations with Indians were mostly peaceful and based on a fairly equal give and take. At one point, Smith was captured by the Indians and threatened with execution by Powhatan, only to be rescued by Pocahontas, reputedly the favorite among his many children, by dozens of wives. The incident has come down in legend, most recently a popular animated film, as an example of a rebellious, love-struck teenager defying her father. In fact, it was probably part of an elaborate ceremony designed by Powhatan to demonstrate his power over the colonists and incorporate them into his realm. John Smith's return to England raised tensions between the two groups, and a period of sporadic conflict began in 1610, with the English massacring villagers indiscriminately and destroying Indian crops. Pocahontas herself was captured and held as a hostage by the settlers in 1613. While confined to Jamestown, she converted to Christianity. As part of the restoration of peace in 1614, she married the English colonist John Rolfe. 2 years later, she accompanied her husband to England, where she caused a sensation in the court of James I, as a symbol of Anglo-Indian harmony and missionary success. But she succumbed to disease in 1617. Her father died the following year. King James I considered tobacco harmful to the brain and dangerous to the lungs, and issued a spirited warning against its use. But increasing numbers of Europeans enjoyed smoking and believed the tobacco plant had medicinal benefits. As a commodity with an ever-expanding mass market in Europe, tobacco became Virginia's substitute for gold. It enriched an emerging class of tobacco planters, as well as members of the colonial government who assigned good land to themselves. The crown profited from customs duties or taxes on tobacco that entered or left the kingdom. By 1624, more than 200,000 pounds were being grown, producing startling profits for landowners. 40 years later, the crop totaled 15 million pounds, and it doubled again by the 1680s. The spread of tobacco farming produced a dispersed society with few towns and little social unity. It inspired a get-rich-quick attitude and a frenzied scramble for land and labor. By the middle of the 17th century, a new influx of immigrants with ample financial resources, sons of merchants and English gentlemen, had taken advantage of the headright system and governmental connections to acquire large estates along navigable rivers. They established themselves as the colony's social and political elite. The expansion of tobacco cultivation also led to an increased demand for field labor, met for most of the 17th century by young, male indentured servants. Despite harsh conditions of work in the tobacco fields, a persistently high death rate, and laws mandating punishments from whipping to an extension of service for those who ran away or were unruly, the abundance of land continued to attract migrants. Of the 120,000 English immigrants who entered the Chesapeake region during the 17th century, 3/4 came as servants. Virginia's white society increasingly came to resemble that of England, with a wealthy landed gentry at the top, a group of small farmers, mostly former indentured servants who had managed to acquire land in the middle, and an army of poor laborers, servants and landless former indentured servants, at the bottom. By 1700, the region's white population had grown to nearly 90,000. Virginia, however, lacked one essential element of English society: stable family life. The colony avidly promoted the immigration of women, including several dozen tobacco brides who arrived in 1620 and 1621 for arranged marriages. But given the demand for male servants to work in the tobacco fields, men in the Chesapeake outnumbered women for most of the 17th century by 4 or 5 to 1. The vast majority of women who immigrated to the region came as indentured servants. Since they usually had to complete their terms of service before marrying, they did not begin to form families until their mid-20s. The high death rate, unequal ratio between the sexes, and late age of marriage for those who found partners retarded population growth and produced a society with large numbers of single men, widows, and orphans. Although patriarchal ideals remained intact in Virginia, in practice, the traditional authority of husbands and fathers was weakened. Because of their own low life expectancy, fathers found it difficult to supervise the careers and marriages of their children. In the colonies, as in England, a married woman possessed certain rights before the law, including a claim to dower rights of 1/3 of her husband's property in the event that he died before she did. When the widow died, however, the property passed to the husband's male heirs. English law was far less generous than in Spain, where a woman could hold independently any property inherited from her parents, and a man and wife owned jointly all the wealth accumulated during a marriage. Social conditions in the colonies, however, opened the door to roles women rarely assumed in England. Widows and the few women who never married took advantage of their legal status as femme sole, a woman alone, who enjoyed an independent legal identity denied to married women to make contracts and conduct business. Margaret Brent, who arrived in the Chesapeake in 1638, acquired land, managed her own plantation, and acted as a lawyer in court. Some widows were chosen to administer their husbands' estates or were willed their husband's property outright, rather than receiving only the 1/3 dower rights. But because most women came to Virginia as indentured servants, they could look forward only to a life of hard labor in the tobacco fields and early death. Servants were frequently subjected to sexual abuse by their masters. Those who married often found themselves in poverty when their husbands died. Although it began under very different sponsorship and remained much smaller than Virginia during the 17th century, the second Chesapeake colony, Maryland, followed a similar course of development. As in Virginia, tobacco came to dominate the economy and tobacco planters the society. But in other ways, Maryland's history was strikingly different. Maryland was established in 1632 as a proprietary colony, that is, a grant of land and governmental authority to a single individual. This was Cecilius Calvert, the son of a recently deceased favorite of King Charles I. The charter made Calvert proprietor of the colony and granted him full, free, and absolute power, including control of trade and the right to initiate all legislation, with an elected assembly confined to approving or disapproving his proposals. Calvert imagined Maryland as a feudal domain. Land would be laid out in manors with the owners paying quitrents to the proprietor. Calvert disliked representative institutions and believed ordinary people should not meddle in governmental affairs. On the other hand, the charter also guaranteed to colonists all privileges, franchises, and liberties of Englishmen. While these were not spelled out, they undoubtedly included the idea of a government limited by the law. Here was a recipe for conflict, and Maryland had more than its share during the 17th century. Further aggravating instability in the colony was the fact that Calvert, a Catholic, envisioned Maryland as a refuge for his persecuted co-religionists, especially the younger sons of Catholic gentry who had few economic or political prospects in England. In Maryland, he hoped, Protestants and Catholics could live in a harmony unknown in Europe. The first group of 130 colonists included a number of Catholic gentlemen and 2 priests. Most appointed officials were also Catholic, including relatives of the proprietor, as were those to whom he awarded the choicest land grants. But Protestants always formed a majority of the settlers. Most, as in Virginia, came as indentured servants, but others took advantage of Maryland's generous headright system to acquire land by transporting workers to the colony. As in Virginia, the death rate remained very high. In one county, half the marriages during the 17th century lasted fewer than 8 years before one partner died. Almost 70% of male settlers in Maryland died before reaching the age of 50, and half the children born in the colony did not live to adulthood. But at least initially, Maryland seems to have offered servants greater opportunity for land ownership than Virginia. Unlike in the older colony, freedom dues in Maryland included 50 acres of land. As tobacco planters engrossed the best land later in the century, however, the prospects for landless men diminished.